And the first weekend, her husband said, "Yeah, he keeps calling my wife at bedtime."
Well, your phone would only let you see like texts from one person, right?
Yeah.
Or something like that. So he wasn't seeing the group chat. He was just seeing like whatever I sent or whoever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He'd be like, what?
Rita finally caught on and she said, "Hey, look, ain't nobody asking him nothing." So she started passing it on, and then she would pass the word to the rest of them what I said.
Yeah. Whatever works, right?
I was glad to get rid of that thing. Woo.
Oh, Charles, you need a phone.
You need one, Mr. Charles.
I know it. I can't die.
We're about to have a deacons meeting pretty soon. I think we were supposed to have it this Sunday afternoon, if I remember correctly. Well, I was trying to share this, but it's not showing my notifications. Try it one more time.
We gotta be out by 7. I got pizza to pick up. Dinner.
Good thing I didn't lay down. I'd been asleep.
There we go.
If I'd laid down, I'd been asleep.
There we go. All right. Share to group. I think is what it is. Yep.
I don't know how to use one of these. I don't know anything about using one of these.
You can get a my mama has one. It's kind of like a smartphone for senior citizens. You can get pictures and texts and calls.
Yeah, but the thing about it is, I don't know what to do with it. Pull up this or pull this that, or see if I can pull this,
right,
or if I can pull that up, or I can whatever.
Possible.
Oh gosh.
Wait.
Okay. Well, that's not what I wanted. Okay, there we go.
Does Faye have one? You know, does Faye have one?
Yeah.
And Ed?
I don't know about Ed. Sister's got one.
They might need to get you.
All right, well, we're ready to get started. So we're going to do the gospel in the book of Ruth. So I thought, Ruth, we did Judges last week, and then it's Ruth. So, real quick, so far we've been going through the Bible. We've gone through the Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books of the Bible, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We talked about Joshua and Judges, and we're continuing on the historical books, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. All of those make up the historical books, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles of the Bible. And so as we move on, we're going to be moving in even further. But as we look at these first 7 books, Genesis through Judges, how would you explain the biblical story up to this point? If you were going to, in just a few sentences, explain the story of the Bible, how would you explain that?
A bunch of ungodliness going on.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it. There's the ungodliness of man. What else?
As long as they had a visible person they could look at,
Mm-hmm.
you read through there, they did fairly well.
Right.
And that's the same way today. What you can't see is almost mentally not there.
Right. Yeah, I agree with that.
And that's what people want, and that's the reason why when you get to Samuel, you'll find out they ask for a king.
Yeah.
They want somebody they can see.
Right. Okay. Yeah, and you see all of this going on. You have all of this going on. You have sin entering the world. You have God. You have that rebellion against God's rule. You have man continually being rebellious. And so those are some of the pictures that we have throughout the Bible. You know, the thing is, I love a good book. I love a good story. And one of the things you need, what are the things you need for a good book? So what do you need to have a good book? What makes a book good?
Interesting characters.
Okay, so you got to have interesting characters.
And fun plots or
good
scary
plot,
plots,
that's right. Good plot.
You know, whatever kind of plot you like.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting plot. And really, if you're going to watch a good movie, you got to have a good word is protagonist, right? Or hero or heroine, right? The person who is the main character. You can have really interesting characters around the main character, but if you don't get invested in the main character of the story, you don't get invested with that hero or heroine, you sort of lose something in the story. And, whether it be, for me, I'm a big science fiction and fantasy guy. Samwise and Frodo from The Lord of the Rings, or it be Guy Montag from Fahrenheit 451. I don't know if y'all recognize any of those characters. Or something more modern as Anna and Elsa from the Frozen movies. Regardless of, hey, how are y'all? Regardless of who it is, we need a good character, a good protagonist. What's up, big man? How are you?
We came to Bible class.
You ready for Bible study? He's like,
don't
just
get me
agreeing.
started. I might take over.
He is.
Right.
He is. So we're in the book of Ruth tonight. So last week we looked at Judges, and we're in the book of Ruth, and we're sort of going through, the fact that every good story has sort of a good character, a main character, and you need that character so that when they're in danger, you sort of take that moment to gasp, or when they're win, you want to cheer, when they're victorious. And so who are some of your favorite characters in a book or a movie or a play that you've ever seen? Who really resonates with you? I was saying Samwise and Frodo from The Lord of the Rings are sort of mine, but who are the people that would resonate with you in your
Scarlett
favorite?
O'Hara and
Okay.
Rocky Balboa.
Okay, Rocky Balboa and Scarlett O'Hara. Okay.
Not together.
So on the movie Sing, which is a cartoon movie that came out in the past 10 years, there is a pig with 1,000 children, probably literally like 50 children, and she does like all the laundry, and she performs, and she's like, everybody's alive. Like, I think like that resonates with me. Like, all the things happen, and she does it with grace.
Okay. So the pig who has the bunch of kids. Okay.
Insane.
Insane. Okay. Anybody else favorite character in literature or movies? Not really.
You've seen a movie, Charles. You got to
Well, I've seen a lot of movies.
Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah.
Stewart.
I showed the Ten Commandments movie aboard ship and got $2 for it. When actually, you only get $1 per movie.
Okay. So you were a little hustler then.
No. A long, lengthy movie like that, you get $2.
Okay.
You can make as much as $30 a month extra.
Just show the movie.
Yeah, show me.
All right. Here's one you probably would recognize. Rooster Cogburn from True Grit would be a good character. A good hero or heroine. I don't know if he's a good guy. He's sort of a weird guy, but I like True Grit. And we can all sit here and think of people that we would say, okay, this is who I resonate with. But the Bible really does have a main character, and that main character is God. A lot of times when we're talking about the Bible, so far we sort of asked, how would you sort of summarize the Bible so far through those first 7 chapters of the Bible? We've looked at Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, and Judges. And so we talked about how we're dealing with the sin of man, we're dealing with all the issues that people go through, and how they connect with God. But really, God is the hero so far of the Bible. So far in our journey, as we go book by book in the Bible, we've seen how God created this perfect world in which man can enjoy worship and glorify Him. Then subsequently we talked about how sin entered the world and how it just sort of broke everything, and yet God was constantly chasing after man in the Bible. And so time and time again we see this picture of God saving man from their self-imposed dilemma. Over and over they're in their own situation. And it doesn't matter where they go. These characters are traveling from Mesopotamia and with Abraham, he saves him, to Egypt with Moses, through the Arabian Peninsula with the Israelites, and finally in the Promised Land. And so as we look at this book of Ruth, we're dealing with this story of God's provision and God's redemption of His people. So let's talk a little bit about the book of Ruth before we get into the gospel in Ruth. The book of Ruth is unattributed, like a lot of Old Testament books. A lot of the Old Testament books don't tell you who wrote them. And so the book of Ruth, by the Jewish Talmud is a collection of writings by rabbis it's sort of a commentary by rabbis about the Old Testament. And they actually attribute the book of Ruth to Samuel. Now, there's a problem with this, and the problem with this is a lot of the information in Ruth seems to come from after Samuel would have died. Like the genealogy leading up at the end of the book that leads all the way to David, you know, and even some of his descendants. That's a little problematic. But then also, we sort of see how they go back and they sort of explain things. You know, one of the things you see in Ruth is they'll stop it. You'll see this in the New Testament too. One of the ways we sort of determine who wrote a book or who it was written to is by what they explain. And let me explain that. If I was talking to someone from Pearl and I said, hey, the Pirates won against the Warriors this weekend. Now, if I'm talking to somebody from Pearl, they know I'm talking about a football or a basketball or a baseball game. And I'm talking about the Pearl Pirates winning a game, right? But if I'm talking to somebody from Nigeria, in their heads, they may be seeing a picture of literal pirates and ships fighting warriors, and they're like, I'm confused, right? And so in the Bible, what you'll see is you'll see in different books, they'll say, this happened, and this is when this used to happen, or this is how this used to happen, because they need to explain it to the audience why this is the way it is. And because of that, a lot of people think that the book of Ruth was probably written later in the reign, anywhere from later in the reign of David to even as far as after the exile, and that it was written down. So we're not real sure who wrote the book of Ruth.
Now, Ruth was David's great-grandmother.
Correct. She was his great-grandmother, correct. But we're not sure who wrote the book of Ruth because it doesn't say this is who wrote the book of Ruth, right? And so it really doesn't matter who wrote the book of Ruth. I mean, sometimes we get hung up on that. We can say, well, you know, my pastor said that Samuel wrote Ruth. And he could have, and you could have had a situation where Samuel wrote the book of Ruth, and later you had some editors who came in and said, well, people don't really understand what this is, so let me explain it. That could have happened, but it also could have been written later. We're not sure who wrote it is all I'm saying. But what we're going to do real quick is we're going to sort of begin looking at Ruth. But regardless of who wrote it, it happened during the time of the judges. So turn in your Bibles to Ruth chapter 1. And let's start there. And there's two little verses I want us to read. So somebody read Ruth 1:1. And then somebody go back to Judges 17 and read verse 6. So who's going to read Ruth 1:1? Okay, go ahead and read that.
Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled, and there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons.
Okay, so it says it was during the time of the judges, and he and his family go to Moab. All right, now who's going to read Judges 17:6?
Yeah, I read.
Okay.
In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes.
Okay, so Ruth is in the context of that time. So what can we know about the circumstances of Israel in Ruth's day based on those two verses? So it's in the time of the judges, and then based on that verse, what does that sort of tell you about the time of Ruth?
The judges were corrupt.
Huh?
Times wasn't so good.
Wasn't good. It was corrupt, right? People are just sort of doing what they want to do. And so you see that in the story of Elimelech and his kids. Now, Elimelech, his name literally means, it comes from 2 Hebrew words, Melech, which means king, and Eli, which means God. It's short for Elohim, which is a name for God. When Jesus is on the cross, he says, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Eloi, which is the Aramaic version of Eli. So he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, so his name literally means God is king. And he comes from a city called Bethlehem. And the name Bethlehem comes from 2 Hebrew words. One is bet, which means bread. And the last part of that, lahem, means house of. So it means house of bread. Okay, so here's the picture. You've got Elimelech, whose name means literally God is the king, who leaves Israel, where God is the king, and goes to Moab, where God is not known, in search from the house of bread, in search for bread for his family. So you've got this guy whose name literally means trust in God because God's in charge, and he says God's not in charge of this mess, we're going somewhere else. So what does that sort of tell you about Eli and his family?
What, judge Eli?
No, I'm sorry, Elimelech and his family.
Well, that was
Little faith.
Naomi's husband.
Yeah, Naomi's son. What? Yeah, he had a little faith. What else did that tell you about him?
He wanted what was best for his family.
Yeah.
Probably desperate.
He was desperate. Yeah. And so, how does that sort of, how can that correspond to our own lives? Thinking about a guy who's desperate, in the situation he's in, what can that tell you about his faith and about the times and what we can do sometimes when times are tough? And what do you think would be a good warning during this for us?
People do desperate things when they're desperate.
Right.
Especially if it comes to their family or,
Right.
you know, they need money, they need food, they need house, you know, whatever it is.
Right.
People are going to do what they need to do to take care of their family.
Right. Oh, I agree. So how might the pattern of sin and rebellion among God's people, remember it says everybody's doing what's right in their own eyes, how might that pattern sort of play into the story of Ruth and Naomi and Elimelech and his sons? How might that play into that, do you think?
Odds are they're not doing right. If they're doing what they think is right, it's probably
Right.
not right.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. And also, I mean,
It's like people think they're doing, you know, I live okay, I'm okay, but
Right.
no, you're not.
absolutely.
Myself, I mean, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
And y'all didn't get this, so I've got one here for you. Let me pull one out for you. This is the Judges cycle we talked about last week. And y'all weren't here to get this, but as you think about the Judges cycle we talked about last week, so where might Israel have been in this cycle of the Judges? Remember the cycle is, here, I'll give you another copy because I may not remember this, or you may remember it. Where might Israel have been in this cycle of sin, servitude, supplication, and salvation? Because
Well,
remember,
they haven't cried out yet, right?
right? No, probably not.
2.5.
Yeah, they're probably in the. Yeah, they're probably.
I was thinking between 2 and 3, so I'll go
Yeah.
with 2.5 with my best.
Yeah, they're in that season of servitude where they're probably being judged by God. Servitude or judgment, pretty much the same thing. God's judging Israel, so they're probably in a cycle of judgment. And we're not sure who the judge is during this time. We're not sure who the judge is going to be after this time. But what we know is Israel's in a bad place, and so Elimelech and his family leave. We don't know who the people that are subjugating it, but we know that God has probably brought judgment on Israel, and they're responding to that judgment. And so what's clear is that Ruth, the beginning of Ruth, is a picture of the sad state of affairs that Israel is in the time of the Judges, where everyone is doing what's right in their own eyes. And so as we go through Ruth, I want you to have that headspace. That's why Ruth is where it's at, because I want you to have that headspace of the Judges in mind when you're going through this. Sometimes we take these stories and we take them out of their context. And we sort of think everything in the Bible is chronological. If we were going chronologically, we would actually, if I was going to teach a chronological Bible story, somewhere in the book of Genesis, I would have to stop and go through the book of Job, because Job probably happened about the time of Abraham. And so we need to sort of get our headspace where this is. This is during the time of the Judges. So if we're going to divide Ruth up, I'm going to divide it into 3 major parts. The first part is going to be chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, which is rebellion, and that's sort of what we're talking about. So Ruth begins with a story of Elimelech of the tribe of Judah from the city of Bethlehem, leaving because of the famine with his wife and 2 sons, and they go to Moab in search for food. But while they're there, they do something that is sinful. So you may say, okay, they're taking care of their family. But the truth of the matter is, once they get to Moab, there's a pattern of sin that sort of shows up. And it's in the marrying of Mahlon and Chilion to these Moabite women. Okay? This is strictly forbidden in God's law. Okay? So you really see... Okay, so at first we could sort of say he's just doing what's best for his family. But now we can't say that. It is clear that Elimelech is doing what's right in his own eye. He's not really seeking God's face. He's not really asking God, what do you want me to do? And so Elimelech is just doing what he wants to, and he marries his sons to Orpah and Ruth. Just a bit of trivia, if you don't know this. Orpah is the name that Oprah was supposed to be named. Oprah gets her name from this story, and her mom misspelled her name, and that's why her name's Oprah and not Orpah. So I thought that was interesting. Not that I have anything one way or another. I'm just saying that's an interesting trivia. But anyway, so what does it tell you? What does it tell you about the headspace of Elimelech and his family that he's given his sons to his two Moabite women?
Very disconnected from the law of God.
Right.
Or
Do you think we can be guilty of doing that, where we get into a situation where we justify? I mean, I could see Elimelech justifying that sin. Well, I'm here. I've got to marry my sons to somebody. There's no Jews here.
the line.
Huh? Yeah. And so there's a justification that comes out of that. How do we tend to do that?
They're doing worse.
Huh?
Someone else is further down in the bar than we
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, it's not as bad as what they're doing.
Yeah, that's
Right.
the phrase I'm looking for.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Sure, I'm doing this, but at least I'm not doing that.
Rationalization.
Yeah. What about Naomi? Where do you think Naomi is in this situation?
She is, that's Elimelech's wife.
Yeah.
But she's still undoubtedly pretty in with God as far as that goes, because the two women
Mm-hmm.
that married their two sons, they were going to go with her to Israel,
Okay.
and they were going to worship their gods.
Okay.
So undoubtedly they had an effect on the two women.
Okay.
So undoubtedly that means, they, she at least she didn't give up God. She would just put him out of her mind.
Okay. Yeah.
She probably just went along with what her husband said.
Okay.
Right? Because that's what women did in those days.
Yeah.
In those days.
Well, that's the same thing with Cain and Abel.
Mm-hmm.
They had to teach their sons about God.
Right.
That's the only way they could know about him.
Right.
In the same way here, because she was so faithful, they wanted the same results that she was receiving from her God. They probably maybe thought her God was better than what their God was.
Okay. That's interesting. Is there any evidence to the contrary to that y'all see in the story of Naomi, or do y'all agree with that?
Her sons died.
Well, her sons died and her husband
She
died.
got left with nothing.
And she was going back to her own people and her own country.
Yeah. I think you're right to an extent, but I also think that I guess my question is hers a cultural religion or is it a living religion? Because I think we're going to see that while I think you're right to an extent, I don't think that Naomi is quite as strong as she probably should have been. If you get what I think Naomi had her faults, I guess is the best way to put it, because she was strong. And I do agree that family, even though they weren't doing exactly what God wanted them to do, they did have enough of an impact on these ladies that they said, okay, there's something different about you guys, even though they weren't perfect. And so there's something encouraging in that. But I think as we move on, we're going to see some things about Naomi that I think show us some things. But, despite God's promises in Deuteronomy 28, God promises Israel, look, if you repent and turn to me, I will provide for you. Your lands will produce food. I will take care of you. Elimelech goes to Moab, okay? Abandons that promise of God. So we at least see that. Now, we could rightly say, now we don't know how old Mahlon and Chilion are when they leave Israel. They may have been young boys when they left Israel. We're not really sure. But they went with their father. Okay, so we see that. I'm going to assume, and culturally, I think they would have stayed with their father until their father's death. So I think their father ruled the house until the death of the father. So I think that would have been a part of it. But I will say this. There is some consequence to the rebellion. And their rebellion, like you said, the consequence is the death of the sons and the father. Okay, so then we have verses 6 through 22 in chapter 1. We have the return of them. And so because of the events of her life, Naomi must make a tough decision. Now, in ancient times, it's pretty clear women were considered property. I mean, that's why when a woman was married to a man, now I think that's overblown a little bit. I do think some people will act like women were disposable and they weren't loved and they were just treated like cattle. That's not really true. They were honored and cherished, but there was a legal transaction. The father controlled the woman and her future, and there was we talk about a dowry where the husband has to pay the father to marry. Basically, he's replacing the work that she would have done in the family. That's what the dowry was. So her worth was, okay, so she's worth, so we look at it and we say, well, you're saying she's worth a couple of cows, but really what they're saying is the work she did would have provided this much food for the family. So you've got to replace that much food so that's why they would give cows and chickens and stuff to sort of replace that work that person was doing in the house. And so I think we overblow it to an extent, but it was still, they didn't have legal rights in a lot of ways. And so it was tough. If a woman was widowed, it could literally be a death sentence to a woman. I mean, it literally could be because, they would have lost a lot in that transaction because they didn't own a lot. And so Naomi decides to go home because at least, why do you think Naomi decided to go home from Moab whenever her husband and sons died?
She didn't have anything to stay for. She
Yeah.
didn't have anything there. She was alone.
Right. So her thinking is, if I go home, maybe somebody will take care of me, right?
Mm-hmm.
At least I'll be among my own people. I mean, it's scary being in a situation where you've lost everything. It's even scarier to be in a situation where you've lost everything in a place that's not your people, right? Mm-hmm. And so she says, okay, I've got to go. And so she knows her only chance is to go back to Bethlehem and hope somebody redeems her and takes care of her. But she also looks at her daughter-in-law and says, look, there's really nothing for you if you go with me. Because in their culture, what would have happened is if a son died without giving a wife an heir, if there was another son, then that wife would be given to that other son. But Naomi makes clear, I'm not going to have any more kids. She's obviously pretty elderly. She said, I can't have any more kids. And if I do find a husband and have more kids, are you going to wait till you're in your, these girls...
They would have to wait for a number of years.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, 13, 14 years old. So if these girls are typical marriage age, they're probably 13, 14, 15 years old. So they're young girls, but they would have been in their 30s. And if they even survived that long, because the life expectancy wasn't as... So it's a big risk for them to go with her, right? And so you find the situation where Orpah says, I'm going to go back, and Ruth says, I'm going to go with you, and don't send me home. We have this beautiful story. So let me ask you a question. How do you view Orpah in this story?
Well, Naomi encouraged them to go back.
Right.
To their own people, their own God, whatever.
Yeah.
That would be natural because they wouldn't know her God.
Right.
But undoubtedly, since they lived with her sons, and we don't know how long that was, but it had an effect on them, both of them.
Right.
But the other one that went back with her people, she conceded to Naomi that you're right. But Ruth, she was determined, I love you.
Right.
And probably like a mother.
Mm-hmm.
And I will be with you and go with you, and there's no way you can stop me. I'll worship your God, I'll love your people, and I will dwell with your people.
So who do you think Orpah was more concerned about?
Herself. Yeah.
And Ruth was more concerned about Naomi.
Right.
And so one of the things we're going to discover as we talk about Ruth, Ruth is a story of redemption. So what does that say about redemption in Christ? What does that teach us about our salvation in Christ?
You can go back. wander away. You can go back.
I think it depends on where we're focused.
Right.
Orpah is focused on herself. And because she's so self-focused, she's so worried about her own well-being now that she misses a chance at redemption. So that selfishness keeps her from that chance at redemption. But because Ruth is focused on something greater, like you said, this God, and trusting this God's going to protect them, that she receives the salvation. And I think there's a faith lesson here. That it's only by dying, and Jesus even says it's only by dying to yourself that you really receive salvation. It's only when Ruth dies to herself and says, I'm going to live for something greater, that she receives that redemption. And so that's a beautiful picture, because Ruth really is a picture of redemption. It's a picture of salvation. It is one of the clearest gospel books in the Old Testament, because there is a lot of gospel in Ruth. I mean, because you see this picture of submission and surrender. And Ruth also paints a picture of this, that anybody can be saved. That's one of the things, that's one of the big questions in the ancient world, is who can be a Jew, right? And the answer of Ruth is anybody who puts their faith in the God of Israel can be a Jew. This is a big, open. And so that's what makes it so sad, is when you get to the Pharisees and they're so shut down to anyone else being one of them unless they jump through all these hoops. And yet you look in the Old Testament, you look at Rahab and you look at Ruth, the fact that it's, if you put your faith in the God of Israel, you can be one of God's children. By the time you get to the Jews, it's if you get circumcised and you do all these religious rites and you jump through these hoops, then you can be a Jew, but you got to do all this. And what the picture of Ruth is, no, it's this gospel faith in God and His saving plan. And so Ruth really has that in there. I love this. It says, Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi and her God provided a model showing that those who were not ethnic Israelites could be incorporated into the people of God through faith. If Moabites who joined themselves to the Lord could be accepted, there was great hope for other Israelites as well. Ruth is a book answering the question, can those who are not Jews be saved? And the answer is yes. And so we see this, and this is really what God says to Israel back in Genesis 22:18 during the covenant. He says, in your offspring all the nations of the world will be blessed. And so this return is a picture of that. But we also see a picture of Naomi, because I asked you about Naomi. What do you see about Naomi? You do see a little darkness in Naomi, because as Naomi's coming back, she calls herself, she changes her name to Mara. And Mara means bitterness. Because while she did pour into these girls enough gospel hope, even though, you know, we say gospel hope, she did pour enough truth that Ruth said, okay, I want that. In her own life, when she's going home, she's really going home pretty hopeless. It's not like she's going home, she's like, oh, God, girls, I'll be okay. I'm going to go home and God's going to take care of me. It's like, I'm just going home to die. At least there's somebody will bury me. I won't be buried on the side of the road. I mean, that's literally what her mindset is. And so while I do agree with you, Naomi is a good character. Naomi is a very flawed character. She's not this beacon of faith that we want her to be. She still has some of that same sin that we all have, that doubt and that frustration that we all have.
All these countries around them and all, they seen and knew what all took place with Israel from the coming out of Egypt.
Yeah.
Just like Rahab told the spies and all, we know this country's yours.
Yeah.
God's going to give it to you. And we're scared.
Yeah.
And whatever. And in Naomi, they saw some hope, undoubtedly.
Right.
But why was God so distant about them? I should say distant, I don't know the right word. That they was wrong for them to marry anybody other than their own people.
Why do you think that was?
Because God was using Israel to show the world that I am God.
Right.
And I am the creator.
Mm-hmm.
I am the sustainer of everything.
Right.
But Israel would not be that way.
Mm-hmm.
And because of it, that's a lot of what took place in all of the Old Testament.
Right.
the Gentile world never did see, but there was, even before Ruth, there was foreigners in Israel, and they were told they would treat them just like they were their own brothers. So there were already other Gentiles in that country.
Yeah, there were.
Yeah.
So why do y'all think? Why do you think God said don't marry these other nations? Why do y'all think that was God's?
Because of their gods.
Right.
False gods, Baal gods.
Right.
There were no gods, couldn't do nothing for nobody.
Well, let me ask y'all this question, because I think this is interesting. Because, I mean, we see often throughout Israel's history these foreign nations sort of trying to marry the Jews so that they can breed out their religion and make them. Why don't you see that as a part of God's plan? Hey, you guys marry these pagans so that they can become followers. Why do you think that is? You ever thought about that? Why is it, from one hand, they'll say, hey, we'll marry these people so we can make them like us, but there's no God saying you marry them so you can make them like you. Why do you think that is?
Because that puts power in the man's hand.
Yeah.
Because even in Ruth, it was her inner call. Yeah. Like, she inside of her decided to go with Naomi before she ever opened her mouth.
Yeah. And I also think there's a seduction to the compromise. It's much easier to compromise and become like them than it is. We don't compromise up. You know what I'm saying? We never compromise up. We always compromise down. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's so important not to be unequally yoked. Because it's never like, I'm going to marry this lost person. I mean, I'm not saying I've never seen anybody marry someone that's lost and that person gets saved. I have. But it's rare. Most of the time what happens is the person who's a Christian compromises and loses their faith or becomes watered down in their faith. And so I think I think it's because of the seductiveness of compromise. Compromise is easy.
It's the same boat we find right here.
Yeah, it's
throughout the whole thing.
Yeah.
Is that God knew man from his heart, what he thought and what he done and everything else and all. And they were weak, and the flesh is enmity against God.
Yeah.
And they would be easily influenced by these other people worshiping these other gods, which they did do.
They did.
And that was their downfall.
And so I guess Ruth is sort of the exception and not the rule in that, because Ruth does. God uses that. And so you see God's sovereign hand in bringing Ruth to salvation through that, because he works all that out to bring her to salvation and to use her. I mean, he's going to use her to be in the line of Jesus. There's something he's teaching, that this gospel is for all the nations. And so it's just interesting to me how it works out like that, because we don't always see that. We've got to be careful, because if we try to do this apart from God, it never works out like this way.
The Bible is not written in chronological order.
No, it's not.
That's the reason why people have so much trouble reading it and understanding it, because you find a little here and a little there and everywhere else.
Yeah. Okay.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I may be jumping the gun. So we were talking about, not having seduction as part of like the salvation plan of the Israelites. So, and then also Naomi having a flaw. Is chapter 3 a flaw, as she is telling Ruth to go lay at Boaz's feet? Is that a seductive move in that nation, or is that just like a?
Yeah, I mean,
it seems pretty seductive to me.
It's
the middle of the night, and I'm sneaking in to lay next to you in bed.
In the Hebrew, the word "uncover the feet" is. One of the things you're going to discover is there's a lot of things, especially when you get in the King James English, where they were like, "Oh, you can't really say that because that's a little we're sort of muted," and so they would mute things. And this is one of them. In Hebrew, the uncovering the feet literally means to uncover the loins, and so it's basically pulling his.
Yikes.
Yeah, and lay at his feet. So.
But I think his response
was to be
is above reproach, and he immediately responds
correct.
Right.
Correct. So I think Naomi is trying to. I think from Naomi's point of view, she is trying to. So this is the last part, redemption, and that's the story of Boaz and Ruth. But yes, you're right, because in that section, I think Naomi is really being worldly.
Yes.
And being seductive. But I think God uses that.
Thing about it is, though, Ruth had changed her gods.
Right.
She put her gods out of her life. And she turned her life over to God.
She did, but we got to remember, she doesn't understand.
Right.
We can't say
Well,
just
there's
because
a
she's
lot-
turned
yeah,
her
well,
life
just
over
like
to
us,
God.
There's a lot of stuff we don't understand.
Right. I think what we need to understand about Ruth is just because she gave her life over to this God doesn't mean she understands his laws and his ways perfectly. So when her mother-in-law, who is a Jewess, says, hey, go uncover his feet,
It
go lay at
shows
his
that She
feet,
was willing to learn.
she probably assumes this is the way things are done, you know?
Well,
And
he had
so-
the right of redemption
Right.
because of her son.
Right. Yeah. And so what I think is happening here, I think God is using, and I think this goes back, we were having this conversation today, me and a group of pastors, we were having this conversation, we were talking about how we live our lives as Christians and how, we were talking about leadership a little bit. We were talking about how, God gives us leadership. One guy made this comment, God gives us leadership as our character in relation to our character. If you have great character, God's going to give you a lot of influence. It's sort of what he was saying. I don't think that's exactly what he was saying, but that's what it sounded like to me. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I really got a problem with that statement. And he said, why? I said, because I loved Ravi Zacharias, and Ravi Zacharias obviously didn't have character. He had a great influence, but he didn't have character. I loved Mark Driscoll, who was pastor at one time, but obviously he didn't have character. I loved James McDonald, but there was some character issues there. And so I'm looking at this and I'm saying there's some great guys that I've loved who had some character flaws, and their leadership was not in relation to their character. And so I think one of the things we talked about was that God uses imperfect people. One of my favorite quotes by Puritan is God uses crooked sticks to draw straight lines. And I think this is one of those pictures where God is using some really imperfect people to have his purposes accomplished. And so while they're not doing things the way that we look back from the future, we look back at this and we say, oh, that's a little gross. Her throwing her daughter-in-law at her cousin, and getting her to sexually advance herself towards this guy. That's sort of gross. But
actually,
God is using that to accomplish his purpose, and he makes something good. It goes back to Joseph where he says, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And I think that is an important verse to understand the Old Testament, is how God often uses some really gross stuff to make something beautiful. And I think that's important to us because we can get very bitter as Christians because we all know leaders who have fallen. We all know people who've made mistakes. And just remembering that God is advancing his kingdom, even though he uses very imperfect people to do that, and we mess up. It gives us grace with each other, because I can look at you and say, boy, you really messed up. But then I can also say, well, I've really messed up too. And God he's got a redemptive plan through these very imperfect people. And I think that's an important lesson to learn. Is that sort of what you were getting to with some of that?
Yes.
And I think that's
It's an
important.
imperfect moment. It's a very crooked moment.
Yeah.
That is very critical in what's going on.
Yeah, and I think that's important because I think we can whitewash this stuff. That goes back to the judges. We whitewash and we make very clean for our kids these stories of the judges, and they are not clean stories. They're disgusting, horrible things. And I think we don't do ourselves any favors as Christians when we try to whitewash everything and make it pretty.
Because then we're surprised when the world around us is broken and dirty.
Yeah.
We feel like, well, it wasn't dirty in the Bible. Wait. Yes,
No, it was.
Yes, it was.
Oh, yeah, it was. This is, could be put on the stand up there and says it's sexually wrong.
Well, it was
Too
sexual.
much in it. What I mean is too much of this, just like you go down
Rated R.
rated
rated
R.
R.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking for. Yeah,
Oh,
rated
yeah.
R.
The rating.
Probably a triple R. Because there's a lot of things in there.
No, we haven't gotten the Song of Solomon yet.
But Boaz was not the original person to redeem her.
No.
There was one ahead of him.
Yeah.
And he went to him.
Yeah.
To redeem her.
Well, ultimately, God is redeeming Ruth.
Well,
Boaz is
true,
just the instrument
true.
that God uses. And I think that's one of the important pieces of all of this, is God is redeeming both Ruth, Naomi, and really he's redeeming Boaz. Because you got to think about it. This is a man who doesn't have a family. He's not a young guy. I mean, our picture of Boaz should be of an older guy who's a single guy, and God is redeeming